In our second lecture, as we think about stress, health, and coping, we're going to talk about responding to stress. Okay, so some different ways that when we feel stressed, that we react. But before we do that, let's quickly take a minute to talk about something called resilience. The APA, or the American Psychological Association, defines resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family and relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. Resilience is the psychological quality that allows some people to be sort of knocked down by the adversities of life and still bounce back. I think of it as that bounce back ability. Rather than letting difficulties, traumatic events, or failure overcome them and drain their resolve, highly resilient people are going to find a way to change course, emotionally heal, and continue moving towards their goals. So, needless to say, resilience is a really good quality. It's one that we want to foster and build. Now, what is the role of resilience in thinking about stress? Let's take a quick look.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
An easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
So, what do you take away from that? Why is resilience so important in thinking about stress? And how can we build resilience in children? So, I think about some ways that we might do that. Maybe it's the way that we teach them. Okay, maybe it's the way that we're modeling for them. Remember, we talked about observational learning. Maybe resilience is something that we can model, that we can show children. Okay, they pay attention to and pick up on the way that we as adults react to stress. So important. And so, along those lines, I want you to think about how you react to stress. What are some examples? Students often say things like, I just want to sleep all day, or I watch a movie that calms me. I go for a run or exercise of some sort. I go for a drive is a big one. We also tend to see a lot of creative outlets. So things like I paint or I write or I play music. Okay, all really common reactions to stress. What happens when we're feeling stress is that we take a potentially stressful event, an exam, a date, a conflict with a partner, And we engage in this subjective cognitive appraisal. In other words, we interpret the event. Remember, I talked earlier about interpretations. And so we think about a lot of different things. We might consider the size of the event. Okay, how much does it matter in the grand scheme of things? One quiz in one class is very different than the comprehensive exam or a dissertation defense. We might also think about how much control do we have? How predictable is this stressor? Okay, I can study really hard for an exam. I have a decent amount of control over what I do there. Other things we have less control over. From there, from our subjective cognitive appraisal, we have three different paths that we can take: emotional, physiological, and behavioral. This should sound an awful lot like that three-factor model of emotion that we discussed a few weeks ago, right? Starting up here with our emotional reactions or responses to stress, we have things like annoyance, anger, rage, apprehension, anxiety, fear, dejection, sadness, grief. Yikes. We know from what we learned about emotion that there certainly can be positive emotions as well. Sometimes stressful events are also exciting. I talked about this a little bit in the last lecture, but one of the most stressed times of my life was in the few weeks leading up to my wedding, which is obviously a very happy and exciting event, but happy stress is still stress. Physiological responses involve our bodies, hormonal fluctuations, neurochemical changes. Anyone here who's a new parent, I don't have to tell you about the way that your body is going to react to the stress of this major life change. And finally, we have our behaviors. How do we behave in response to the stressor? Oftentimes, we will engage in coping strategies. There's all different kinds, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but some coping strategies are better than others. Right? So going for a run or painting or expressing ourselves through artwork is a very different form of coping than drinking or using drugs or things like that. So we'll hold that thought. We'll talk more about those. This should sound familiar. We talked about broaden and build when we covered emotion and motivation, and I told you we'd revisit it when we got to stress, health, and coping. So here we are. Just to refresh your memory, Barbara Friedrichsen developed the broaden and build theory to expand on the work that had been done in psychology on negative emotions and physiological maladjustment. So rather than arguing that positive emotions should replace negative emotions, that's not what we're saying here. Premise of the broaden and build theory is that both types of emotions have to coexist. Positive emotions simply function to build resources to help us cope with those more negative ones. Friedrichsen further argued that positive emotions promote resilience in a lot of different ways by altering people's mindsets, broadening the scope of attention, increasing creativity and flexibility in problem solving, by undoing lingering effects of negative emotions. What this does is it helps to short circuit those possibly damaging physiological responses to stress that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Also helps by promoting rewarding social interactions that help to build valuable social support and enhanced coping strategies. Think about what we learned several weeks ago when we talked about behavior, operant conditioning, right? What happens after the event? Is it reinforcing? Is it punishing? So if we engage in a difficult social interaction and it goes really well and we see valuable change and social support come from that, we're going to be more likely to use that sort of confronting the issue as a coping strategy later on in the future because it worked really well. And so the broaden and build theory argues overall that a positive emotional style has a lot of benefits, both physical and also psychological. So I want to show you this video. This is Barbara Friedrichsen. She's going to talk a little bit more about what her theory means.
The jump for joy positive emotions can seem kind of trivial, out of place, maybe irrelevant. And what I want to argue is that that's really, nothing could be further from the case. There are a whole range of positive emotions, including that feeling in our bones grateful for our current circumstances, completely in tune with our environment, at one, at peace, feeling serene and tranquil and savoring that. Sharing laughter with a close loved one or friend and the lightness of that moment. Being inspired by great leaders. These are all important positive emotions that are really quite relevant, especially when we're facing difficult times. Feeling the love and closeness of people we care for. Now, all of these different positive emotions and more share in common two core truths. There are two core truths about these positive emotions. One is that they open us. They literally change the boundaries of our minds and our hearts and change our outlook on our environments. Now, let me get poetic here for just a moment. Imagine that you're this water lily. It's early dawn and your petals are closed in around your face. If you can see out at all from that vantage point, it's just a little spot of sunlight, okay? But as the sun rises in the sky, things begin to change, and your delicate blinders around your face begin to open, and your world quite literally expands. You can see more. Your world is larger, okay? Now, sunlight is what changes the openness of flowers like this. The openness of our minds and hearts obey the warmth of positivity, the warmth of positive emotions, changes how open our visual perspective is at a really basic level, and our ability to see our common humanity with others. And we know this because we've done randomized controlled studies where we induce positive emotions by the flip of a coin. Some people are either given a dose of positive experiences, cute puppies, goofy penguins, beautiful sunsets, or neutral pictures, chairs, light switches, things like that. Other studies use a very simple paradigm that was developed by Alice Eisen decades ago, where you give people a gift of candy, all wrapped up in cellophane, so you know it's not a sugar high that's creating but it's a gift, a token. They're either given the gift before the experiment starts or after it's over. In other studies, they have people listen to pleasant music. Now, in these kinds of studies, we know that it changes the way people view, can kind of step back and take in the big picture. Here's a study from my own lab where we gave people a series of tests like this where we showed a comparison figure, a target figure on top, and then asked which of these two comparison figures most resembles this. Now, there's no right or wrong answer. They each resemble it a little bit, but this one resembles it in its global configuration, this one more in its local detail elements. And what we know is that if you inject positive emotions, people are more likely to step back and see the big picture and see the similarities along those lines. Other work on this opening or broadening effect has used eye tracking, where they lock in a camera on the iris and see what people are looking at. And if you give people that little gift of candy before they do a study like this, they're more likely to look around all the different aspects of a complicated array. If you don't give people a gift of candy, they pretty much just look at the center baby and they don't look at the babies on the side. So we know that positive emotions widen the scope of what people are scanning for in the environment. Rumi wrote about this in the 13th century and captured this aspect of what positive emotions can do. He wrote, "There is a way of breathing that's a shame and a suffocation." It really narrows us down. There's another way of expiring, a love breath, he called it, that lets us open infinitely. Okay, so we have dozens of studies now that show us that this isn't just poetic language. Now, our studies don't underscore the infinitely part. That part may take a few more years to get us to that level. But we do know that positive emotions open our awareness. They increase the expanse of our peripheral vision. We see more. And there are a lot of places where this matters. Because we see more possibilities. People come up with more ideas about what they might do next. when they're experiencing a positive emotion relative to when they're experiencing neutral states or negative emotions. People are more creative. Some of the earliest work in this area showed how tests of creativity that used to be used for graduate admissions, that if you give people a bag of candy before they complete those tests, they score higher on them. Okay, they're no longer used for graduate admissions. But people are more creative, and this widening of awareness has been directly linked to this greater creativity. People are more likely to be resilient. I have a whole line of research on resilience where we've shown that people are able to bounce back quicker from adversity when they're experiencing positive emotions. Some other research has shown that kids do better on a math test or in a learning context if they're just asked to sit and think of a positive memory before they take the test. So there's better academic performance. Really neat work on physicians making better medical decisions, better at integrating the complex information of an unsolved case when they're given a bag of candy, a really small positive emotion induction. So maybe you should go to your doctor's office with that bag of candy. One of the studies that one of my former students, Kareem Johnson, and I did together looked at how positive emotions allow us to look past racial and cultural differences and see the unique individual and recognize individuals across racial lines, to see past difference and to see towards oneness. There are other experiments that show if you induce positive emotions, people are more trusting, people come to better win-win solutions in negotiations, all kinds of effects. And I want to just emphasize that this isn't the same story that we've known for decades, that positive emotions help us see the world through rose-colored glasses or see the glasses half full rather than half empty. I'm not saying that these views are wrong, but it's not the whole story. In addition, we're also seeing the big picture. At a very fundamental level, we're able to see larger systems, see larger forms of interconnection when we're experiencing positive emotions, and that can make a huge difference when we're trying to address some of these really entangled societal problems that we face.
And so if this is something that you're interested in, I recommend our positive psychology course. We'll go a lot more in depth on the idea of broaden and build and the idea of positive psychology in that class. But for now, we're just kind of giving you the overview. You might remember from a few weeks ago, again, in the week on emotion and motivation, we discussed the Yerkes-Dodson law. Anyone remember what that was? Dig back in your memories. Basically, the Yerkes-Dodson law states that increased levels of arousal improve performance, but only up till the optimum level of arousal is reached. At that point, performance begins to suffer as arousal levels increase. Another maybe less complicated way of saying that is that there's a sweet spot in the relationship between arousal or stress and performance. You don't want to be too relaxed or too cavalier when you're approaching a task or a stressful event, because it means you probably don't care enough or you might not be taking it seriously. But you don't want to be so stressed out to the point where you're incapacitated. So the example I usually give is if you have a big exam, I want you to be stressed enough that shows that you are aware of the importance of this assignment, that you're thinking about it, that you're taking it seriously, but not so stressed that you are completely rendered helpless and you cannot focus at all. So that's kind of that sweet spot right up here at the top of this N-shaped looking line. If we're looking at levels of stress down here and performance on the vertical axis, you see how when we have very low levels of stress, we have low levels of performance. It increases up into a certain point. So this is when you're about middle of the way stressed, and this is where you're performing the best. Once you get into higher levels of stress, your performance tanks again. And the complexity of the task matters as well. If you're doing a complex task, high or low levels of stress or arousal will affect you more than if you're doing something simple. We also see this with graduate school applications. So students will experience this when they're applying. Increased arousal leads to better performance because you're more alert, you're more focused, attentive. You're really dedicated to the task at hand. But excessive arousal can lead you to just being so overwhelmed. You're so nervous, you're unable to concentrate, you don't know what to do. When arousal levels are very high or very low, our performance tends to be worse. More complex tasks require less emotional arousal than simpler tasks. That makes sense. The more complicated something is, the less stress it takes for it to really start to impact you. Now, when we consider our physiological or our bodily reactions to stress, we can think about this in terms of three stages. Alarm is the physiological arousal occurring as the body prepares to combat a threat. This is that, oh no, OMG moment when you start to realize something feels off. Then we have resistance. This is the stage where we see stabilized physiological changes as coping efforts start to get underway. Okay, so resistance might be that point at which we're starting to mobilize those fight or flight reflexes. We're starting to think, what is it that we want to do? And finally, we see exhaustion. This is the depletion of bodily resources if your stress can't be overcome. How many of you have had a really difficult exam or a really difficult assignment? You turn it in or you take that exam and you just zonk. You just have absolutely nothing left. You feel like you just ran a marathon. Stress is exhausting. So even if it's not a physical stressor, even if it's an emotional stressor, it can really make you quite tired and worn out. And it can also do things in our brains as well. I want to show you this video about what happens in teenagers and the relationship between different parts of the brain when we think about stress.
Okay, we're going to run a short localizer scan now.
Recently, new neuroimaging technology enabled the Wisconsin team to see whether or not parental stress might impact the very architecture of their adolescent children's brains. The team especially wanted to look at one critical brain circuit, the connection between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. The amygdala recognizes threat and sounds the alarm. In turn, the prefrontal cortex signals the amygdala whether the alarm is justified.
We want to see a good flow of traffic on that highway because that's a highway that's helping that child regulate their emotion on a moment-to-moment basis. How to deal with emotions, when is it appropriate to express emotions, what are good things to feel, what are bad things to feel. So we can get right in the middle of the amygdala there. That was fantastic.
So, was there a difference in these two parts of the brain in those adolescents who'd experienced early life parental stress?
When we look at it now that they're 18 years old, we see lower connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex.
For the kids with early stress exposure, it was just way out of whack. What we found was a pattern that absolutely fits with the rest of our data.
It was an amazing thing to see, and to see such strong associations throughout. And this whole pattern then predicted anxiety in these adolescent girls.
It really is setting up a system that responds differently to stress in the future.
When we're stressed out, we're not taking in as much information. We're not functioning as well in our daily lives. We might be getting everything done, but maybe we're not learning as well.
And so it does have an effect on later achievement and academic outcomes. In terms of health and functioning, we know that they do worse than kids who are less stressed.
So stress can actually play a role in changing our brains, which is pretty crazy, right? And really goes to show some of the powerful impacts that stress can have. So let's think about some of the responses to stress. Once we emotionally and physiologically process that we have a stressor that we need to deal with, the next step is to respond. What do we do about it? And there's a lot of different ways we can do this. One is to give up. Maybe we're just blaming ourselves or engaging in self-sabotaging behaviors. So let's talk a little bit about learned helplessness. Wait, I'll go back to the last slide. Learned helplessness is a form, it sort of falls under this giving up category. Learned helplessness occurs after being repeatedly subjected to an aversive stimulus that we can't escape. Eventually, what happens is we stop trying to avoid the stimulus and we behave as if we're utterly helpless to change it. Even when opportunities to escape are presented, this learned helplessness prevents us from taking action. This concept is strongly tied to animal psychology and behavior. For those of you who are taking behavior modification, or you will take it, you'll hear this again. We'll talk about learned helplessness in that class as well. But it can also apply to many situations involving human behavior. We see this a lot in domestic violence situations. When people feel like they have no control over their situation, they may behave in a manner which is helpless, hence the learned helplessness. This inaction can then lead people to overlook opportunities for relief or for change. So I'm going to show you this video.
Human beings have a need. In the late 60s, Martin Seligman and his colleagues were doing research on classical conditioning, a process in which an animal or human associates one thing with another. Martin is an American psychologist, educator, and author of self-help books. He earned his bachelor's degree in physiology at Princeton and a PhD in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1967. This is the time and place his foundational experiments and theory of learned helplessness began. 3 groups of dogs were used for this experiment, so if being mean to dogs really upsets you, this is your warning. The first group were put into a harness for a period of time. Nothing was done to them, and after a while they would be released. Group 2 was attached to the same harness and administered light shocks that the dog could stop if they pressed a button. The dogs in Group 3, however, were placed in the same harness and given the same shocks, but their buttons did nothing to stop it. Seligman was teaching them, rather effectively, that there was nothing they could do to escape the shocks. Once these 3 groups had completed their first experimental manipulation, all dogs were placed one at a time in a box with 2 chambers. In the side of the box they were placed in, the floor would administer similar shocks that all the dogs could escape if they jumped through the barrier to the safe side. This is where Seligman discovered the differences in behavior gained from the first part of the experiment. Dogs in Group 1 and 2 quickly discovered that they could escape the unpleasant feeling if they moved out of the chamber, but most of the dogs in Group 3 would simply lie down and whine while they were being shocked. Seligman wondered if the condition could be cured. He wanted to change the expectation that nothing could be done to alleviate stress. So he had colleagues demonstrate to the dogs and physically move their legs to try to get them to hop out of the electric chamber. They offered treats and rewards to the dogs, but even with a way to escape, a path shown, and rewards offered, dogs in Group 3 were unaffected. They had been conditioned to think there was nothing they could do to avoid the pain and gave up. The condition was labeled learned helplessness.
That's a good stopping point. You can watch the rest of this if you're interested. But again, we see this in humans as well. It's this idea that you've learned that nothing you do will change things, so you may as well just sort of lay down and give up. Okay. We can also think about striking out as another category. If we look back on our list of behavioral responses, we talked about giving up. We can also talk about sort of striking out or lashing out. Let's go back down here. Ever feel so frustrated and stressed that you just kind of lash out at anyone who gets close to you? We've all done it, and it's not our best look, but it happens to the best of us. Sometimes our stress manifests in these externalizing behaviors, things like aggression. Aggression is any behavior that's intended to hurt someone, either physically or verbally. We've talked about this many times over the course of the semester, so we can just leave it there. Let's think about catharsis. Okay, you've probably heard this term before. Catharsis is the release of emotional tension. According to psychoanalytic theory, this emotional release is linked to a need to relieve unconscious conflicts. For example, experiencing stress over a work-related situation might cause feelings of frustration and tension. These feelings of stress, anxiety, fear, anger, trauma, they can cause intense and difficult feelings to sort of build up over time. And think about water sort of building up, water pressure, right? At a certain point, there's so much emotion, so much turmoil, it becomes overwhelming. It sort of explodes. People express this as this feeling like I was going to burst. I couldn't contain my emotions or my feelings anymore. They have to find some sort of vent or some sort of way to release the pent up emotion. Like imagine a balloon that you're filling up with water. It only holds so much water. Eventually, that pressure has to release, or something's going to give, right? The balloon's going to explode. Okay. Now, there are different ways we can do this. Okay. There are certainly inappropriate ways that we can engage in catharsis. I'll talk about that in a second. But there's also far more appropriate ones. Going to the gym and hitting a punching bag is sort of your classic example of catharsis. Okay, so you are engaging in that sort of release of frustration, release of energy, but you're doing it in a really socially appropriate way. And it doesn't have to be physical relief. Okay, ever just have a good cry and you feel better afterwards, or you have a long conversation with a friend, and then you feel sort of lighter, like you've released a lot of that tension and stress into the world. It doesn't have to be physical. Okay, so catharsis can certainly be psychological or emotional as well. Now, there are less adaptive ways of striking out when we engage in aggression against others, when we engage in violence. These are far less adaptive forms of striking out, but also fall under that category. Next up is indulging. Sorry, I realize I'm a little bit going out of order here, but next up is indulging. So let's take a look at that. Sometimes when we get so stressed, we find ourselves experiencing reduced impulse control or self-indulgence. I have this picture of Ben in a giant tub of Ben and Jerry's on here because stress eating is certainly one of these things. Okay? Where, it's one thing to just have a couple bites of Ben and Jerry's to make yourself feel better, versus finding yourself binging the entire container of ice cream. So indulgence, right? This is when we sort of give in, and we reduce our impulse control. We just sort of let go hog wild. Okay. There is certainly nothing wrong with having some ice cream when you're stressed. I would also argue that there's nothing wrong with binge eating an entire container of ice cream when you're stressed. The issue becomes moderation. So when we're doing this regularly, when this becomes our go-to coping mechanism, that's when it's a problem. We tend to think about food as the primary thing for indulgence, but we're also seeing newer forms of indulgence: internet addiction, excessive gaming, preoccupation with sex or sexual content online, obsessive socializing. So the internet has led to new creative worlds in which we can overindulge. Online gambling, things like that. So indulging is really just anything that we do sort of when we're breaking the bonds of moderation. We are no longer engaging in things at a normal or a typical or a healthy level. It's when we're really going overboard. And finally, there is coping. Okay, so these are all forms of coping mechanisms, but coping kind of in and of itself is an active effort to master, reduce, tolerate, or sort of deal with the demands that are created by stress. There's a lot of different ways that we can cope, and we've already talked about a few. The book discusses two specific forms of coping mechanisms: defensive and constructive. Defensive coping involves defense mechanisms that are largely unconscious reactions. They're there to protect us from unpleasant emotions. In these cases, our self-deception distorts our reality, making things seem less threatening. And these are largely unconscious. We might not even be aware that we're doing it. Maybe we're trying to repress the stressor or to avoid it. Ever have a situation where you just can't deal with whatever's stressing you, so you just kind of pretend it's not happening? On the other side, we have constructive coping. This involves relatively healthy efforts that people make to deal with stressful events. So with constructive coping, now we're confronting problems head on. We're avoiding excessive self-deception, highly unrealistic negative thinking. We're avoiding all of those things. We're reappraising our stressful events in ways that are less threatening. And we're ensuring that our bodies are not especially vulnerable to these damaging effects of stress. So I could ask which one sounds better. Hopefully you recognize that constructive coping is the better way to go. We're sort of confronting things head on or dealing with them in ways that are much more adaptive. And so I want you to take a minute and think about ways that you might cope. Okay, what are some different coping strategies that you engage in? Maybe it's having a comfort food. Maybe it's a massage or rest, things like that. So take a minute and think about that. Have an exercise here. And so I want you to actually try this. Okay. So I want you to think about, how stressed do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? How stressed do you feel? Write that number down in your notes. Then I want you to stand up. Stand with your feet shoulder width apart. Stand straight, strong, confident body posture. Put your arms and hands by your side. Relax them. Relax your body. Close your eyes. Think back to that meditation we did at the beginning of the first lecture. We're going to focus on your lower abdomen, kind of into your belly. Imagine that there's a small balloon in there. And you're going to breathe in slowly and deeply through your nose. Imagine that balloon inflating, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, very slowly. And then hold that deep breath for a few seconds. Then slowly exhale through the mouth, imagining that the balloon's gently deflating. Blow out of your mouth like you're blowing through a candle. Might help to put your hand over your lower belly. You can sort of feel it going up and down. Make sure you're not breathing with your chest. So you're going to breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. I want you to repeat that 10 times, in and out. And when you're done, I want you to take stock of your body. Do you feel relaxed? Do you feel calm? Do you feel lighter? Do you feel tired? Think about how it compares to your stress score from earlier. Did it increase? Did it decrease? Did it stay the same? Not everybody responds well to breathing exercises. They are a bit of a learned trait. But for those of you who do benefit from deep breathing or mindfulness exercises, this is a pretty quick and easy coping mechanism, something that you can do in the moment. It doesn't take up a lot of time or energy, and it might help to make you feel less stressed. So the next time you are confronting something that you find especially challenging, maybe try some breathing work to help calm you down and to help you cope with whatever is stressing you out. In our next section, we will talk about stress and physical health. We've talked a little bit about the way that stress can impact the body, but we'll get more into that in the next lecture.